Hi, everyone, and welcome to this webinar for Know What Impaired Means, Connecting Youth and Parents on Cannabis-Impaired Driving. I'm going to give a second for more participants to sign on. It's great to see everyone joining us. So I will get started in just a second. Okay, so welcome again. My name is Stephanie Cowell, and I'm Director of Knowledge Translation at Parachute. For this webinar today, I'll be joined by two other speakers, also from Parachute, my wonderful colleagues, Anusha Ranjan, who is a coordinator in knowledge translation and programs at Parachute, with a focus specifically on our road safety programming, and Kelly Tien, who is our Vice President of Communications and Marketing. Parachute is Canada's national charity dedicated to injury prevention, and we envision a Canada free of serious injuries with Canadians living long lives to the fullest. And within the area of injury prevention, we have a few strategic priorities. These are focused on urgent and immense injury issues in Canada. These include falls, motor vehicle crashes, poisonings, and incidents from sports and recreational activities, with a particular focus on concussion injuries. Our goal for the webinar today in talking about the Know What Impaired Means program will be for you to learn about strategies we use to target specific demographics in our program. So these are cannabis users ages 15 to 24, as well as their parents as influencers of youth behavior. Through this webinar, you will also understand the core components and key messages of the program, particularly our recent Have This Talk campaign. And you'll understand the key learnings and takeaways we have from this campaign and program. So what this looks like in terms of our agenda for the next hour, I will first pass it on to Anusha, who will talk a little bit about the issue at hand, the issue of cannabis-impaired driving overall, and as it applies specifically to teens and young adults. We'll provide a brief recap of the first phase of our Know What Impaired Means campaign, which previously took place. We'll then walk into further detail about the second phase of this campaign, as well as our new campaign, Have This Talk. After that, I will be back to talk about the results, some of the results of the campaign, the evaluation results, as well as some of the key lessons, challenges, and takeaways from this campaign that we want to share with others doing work in this area. From there, we will have time for a question and answer session. And at that point, Julie Taylor from Parachute will come on board to moderate the Q&A session for us. A note to please use the Q&A section that you find in your Zoom menu in order to submit your questions. You can start submitting your questions as soon as you'd like. Julie will be monitoring that and will bring those questions forward at the end of all of the talks. So without further ado, please welcome Anusha to talk about the issue of cannabis-impaired driving.
Great, thank you, Steph. So I'll start off the webinar with some background information on the issue of cannabis-impaired driving in youth. So as you can see from the slide here, Canadian youth have one of the highest rates of cannabis use worldwide, and the use of cannabis is actually 2 times higher in the 15 to 24-year-old age group compared to adults over the age of 25. Now, the average age of first use was 20 years old in 2020. And it's interesting to note that when we actually first started our project in 2019, the average age of first use was actually slightly lower at around 18.9 years old. Here, when we look specifically at motor vehicle crashes and impairment, we see that motor vehicle crashes are the top cause of unintentional injury for Canadians aged 15 to 24. And a significant number of these young drivers who are killed in motor vehicle crashes test positive for drugs and or alcohol. This highlights why this topic is just so important for our target audience and also for us to tackle. And as you know, cannabis and driving really should not mix, as cannabis impairs cognitive and motor abilities necessary to drive safely by affecting things like our balance and coordination, motor skills, attention, judgment, etc. Now, looking at the toll of cannabis-related collisions, we see that 16 to 34-year-olds represent 32%, so about a third of Canada's population, but they suffer 59% of injuries from cannabis-related collisions, 61% of fatalities from cannabis-related collisions, showing us that youth and young adults are involved in a disproportionate amount of cannabis-related collisions. And yet, given this increased risk among young drivers, only 11% of parents have had this discussion with their teenagers about the risks of driving under the influence of cannabis, which alludes to the second phase of our campaign, which my colleague Kelly will tell you a bit about later on in the webinar. So, given this urgent need to address cannabis impaired driving among youth, as evidenced by the statistics we presented today, Parachute launched the Know What Impaired Means campaign. And this is funded by Health Canada's Substance Use and Addictions Program. It's a multi-phase project that's run from 2019, which is when we first launched, to 2021, and it is a bilingual project as well. The main goals of our Know What Impaired Means project are to create and launch a comprehensive national drug impaired driving awareness campaign that's focused on teens and young adults and is informed by this population and is also evidence-based. The first phase was to focus on reaching youth, and with our second phase, we've expanded our reach to parents as well. We also aim to provide professionals working in injury prevention and road safety with learning opportunities from the national campaign, our key messages, and our overall approach, so they too can apply this in their own work and communities. Okay. So as mentioned, we launched phase one of the Know What Impaired Means campaign in 2019 to 2020. We previously presented a webinar on phase one in 2019, so I'm just going to give a quick recap of what our phase one campaign looked like. So here on this slide, you'll see the main components of our first phase listed. So we conducted a national survey of youth on their cannabis use and driving behaviors. We developed the Know What Impaired Means campaign videos and GIFs, which were used in our youth-targeted, nationally promoted social media campaign, which included paid influencers. We also had the installation of the impaired light sculpture at the CNE in Nathan Phillips Square in Toronto. And we held our first Know What Impaired Means professional webinar, and we integrated our Know What Impaired Means messaging into the National Teen Driver Safety Week campaign of 2019. And now I'll just go into a brief overview of each of these components listed here. So these are some of the findings from our national survey, which was completed in August 2019. We found that 19% of 16 to 24-year-olds with a license reported driving within 4 hours of using. And 53% believed it's safe to drive less than 5 hours after using cannabis. And we also found that 12% believe it's safe to drive within an hour of using cannabis. These results were also generally aligned with the results of other national cannabis surveys as well. Also from our survey, we looked at the risks to passengers of cannabis-impaired drivers. So we found that 35% of 16 to 24-year-olds reported riding in a vehicle driven by someone who had used cannabis within 4 hours, and 33% do not feel confident that they would be comfortable asking a peer who was under the influence of cannabis not to drive. Now, we used the results of the survey to focus the campaign on the gaps in youth perceptions and behaviors. We applied a harm reduction lens, which is described in the slide here. which is a common public health approach for issues related to substance use. If youth are using cannabis, which are, the data indicates they are, let's ensure that they are not driving impaired or getting into a vehicle with an impaired driver. We also want to note that it's important to acknowledge that non-medical cannabis use is not legalized in Canada for use under the age of 18 or 19 years of age, depending on the province or territory. As mentioned, we also created campaign videos, and for the first phase, we created videos and we shared them on our social media platforms, and they were promoted to our target age group. These videos were created to work with and without sounds to match video scrolling behaviors on social media, and these are just a few examples of those. They were also shared on campus and restaurant digital boards at university campuses. And we also developed short campaign GIFs that were shared on Instagram as well, and these can also be found on our website. And this is the impaired sculpture that we had installed at the CNE and Nathan Phillips Square, both of which are popular spots for our target age demographic. And as you can see, the sculpture is made up of words used to describe what it feels like when you use cannabis. So words like high, ripped, lit, stoned, and when strung together, you see the vertical word forming impaired in those red lights. So this was a good Instagrammable spot that served as a conversation starter both in person and online. And finally, we also incorporated our Know What Impaired Means messaging into our annual NTDSW campaign using the hashtag Know What Impaired Means on social media throughout our campaign. And we also incorporated the messaging into our toolkits and our activities for the week. And yeah, to wrap up our little summary of phase one, this is just a brief overview of the communications reach that we had from our first phase of the campaign. So we had 11.8 million impressions targeted to the youth demographic, and that included the donated campus ad space, the digital ad space, the viewing of the sign at CNE, Facebook and Instagram boosted posts, as well as influencer posts. And we also had an additional 7 million impressions for the hashtag Know What Impaired Means on social media. And great, so now I'm actually going to turn it over to my colleague Kelly, who will tell you more about phase two.
Thanks very much, Anusha. So for our second phase, which ran through 2020 into early 2021, this was a second round of approaching the youth demographic, same as the first round, but we had a new component, which was trying to develop a campaign that would speak to adult influencers, primarily parents of teens and young adults. We worked with our agency to come up with Have This Talk. So the tactic that we used, we did repeat some of the videos and the collateral that we had from the first wave, but in the interim, TikTok had really had a surge as a popular spot for the demographic of 15 to 24. So we developed what our agency nicknamed Cannabis, little bits of video related to cannabis for TikTok. So these portrayed three scenarios. How could you decorate your mom's birthday cake, give your dog a trim? Would you dye your hair? Would you do any of these things if you were blitzed or stoned or high? And if you wouldn't do that, why would you get in a car? So we can go to the next slide to play a couple of these. And if we could play the one on the right first, Stephanie, that is, so this is with the original music.
Did you actually make that for Mom?
Thanks. And the next one, you'll notice the music is different. And what our social media specialist was able to do was to jump on a bandwagon. On TikTok, people set things to very popular songs as their themes that are going on. So we redid the music, and we'll show you the one that's about the dog trim now.
Just did a bad thing. I regret the thing I did. And you're wondering what it is. I'll tell you what I did. I did a bad.
Now you'll notice on that video, it says you'll drive and what you see is a little bit of a green and a little bit of a blue. You cannot use the word cannabis, you cannot use the word high. TikTok has very exacting standards about no drug talk. And even if it's legal in Canada, it's not legal in other jurisdictions in the world, and these platforms are international. So we discovered through research that there were actually, these symbols were understood to mean high in TikTok world. So we adapted them for the videos.
Just did a
In addition, we did add some information to the Know What Impaired Means to our National Teen Driver Safety Week. The main theme this year was related to speeding, but we did include, as you can see from this illustration, some of our organic social posts with messaging around cannabis impairment. So the new goal, the reaching the parents of youth. So nagging at kids, telling them what to do is not going to work. And this was from research that our agency brought and from our KT team about what works in dialogue with teenagers. But it is helping them realize that they should not drive impaired or be involved in impaired driving. And we came up with a way to get that message across in a humorous way. So we had fortunate donations from Bell Media. So we created a PSA that could be played on the television networks across the country. This was our primary outreach, although we also did targeted boosted posts on social media for the parent demographic. And people were driven from that to the website parachute.ca with more information about how to have that talk. Now, some challenges we wanted to point out is because of COVID, we had lots of restrictions. We could not do the filming as originally envisioned. We had to cut back on the number of PSAs we filmed because we had to have casting, and the whole film set was restricted. Everything took longer to do. So because of this, we had to get creative, and we were able to cast a real life father and son to play the roles you're about to see. And those folks then could be in close physical proximity for the photo shoot because they live together. For the mother and daughter, well, you can't really tell. They are shot sort of separately and put together in the ad. They're sitting a safe distance apart. And we also were fortunate to find an actress who was bilingual who could play the mother. And this PSA is also available in French. And what we were able to do is to dub and sort of cut in the lines, French-speaking lines for the daughter, so that we were able to have a French-speaking PSA for the Quebec market. So lots of changes. We've all had to be very nimble in these times. And certainly these spots really evolved to respond to what we were able to do given COVID restrictions. Okay, and here's the first one. Have this talk, father and son.
Hey, son, got a minute? I think it's time we had the talk.
Oh boy.
You're getting to be an age where some of your friends may be doing it.
Dad.
Now, you may think it's fun, no big deal, or safe, but it's not. You might think that you'd be good at it, but you won't be.
What are we talking about?
Driving high. What did you think? Good talk.
And now on to the second, we called Mom and Daughter.
Hey, honey, do you have a minute?
Yeah, what's up?
Well, I feel a little awkward, but I think it's time we had this talk.
Here? Now?
It'll only take a minute. Now, I know it seems like everyone's doing it, and it's no big deal, and it's safe, but it's not. If you're ever in a situation, maybe it's you and a close friend, or who knows, maybe there's a lot of people involved.
Whoa, what are you talking about?
Driving high. What did you think?
That one still makes me giggle every time I see it. So we certainly had our challenges with not only doing that, but we got a mix of reactions, and we'll talk about those in a minute. We also, again, drove people to the parent resources on the website. So there was a lot more information. If you were interested in finding out more about how to have that talk, the information was available to you at parachute.ca/have this talk. So the key messages that we are presenting to parents are why we have this talk, what it's about, and how to do it. So again, all of that was created by our KT team working on drawing from the best resources that were available. And Steph, you would like me to finish up with the phase 2 outreach that we had, which was really wonderful, 54 million impression plays. That PSA was played 2,370 times across the country in Canada, focused group time in October and then again in January and February. And a tip to all of you who are considering doing campaigns, January and February are a relatively slow time in media in terms of advertising. It's the post-Christmas rush. The Christmas is over, all of that advertising dollars has been spent. So there actually is some space in January and February. So it's a good thing to know that your media partners might be more amenable and you might get more plays if you have something to play in that January and February window. We had 3.4 million social media impressions for the hashtags. So that is both have this talk and know what impaired means. And those direct videos that we promoted on Facebook, about 525,000. We do have a note that we had real difficulties getting the mother and daughter video approved in Quebec. It was running in Facebook for, I think, about 2 days, got about 50,000 plays, and then Facebook pulled the ad as being something that was reviewed. Somebody complained about it and it was pulled. So this is something that we really discovered working in this campaign is we can have all the great material in the world, but when you try to buy a space to share it, that there are a lot of restrictions that come up. There are rules. The goalpost move, something that could be approved last year will get turned down this year, exactly the same thing. So it is a lot of patience and testing and reshaping your messaging to see what will be acceptable through the social sharing mediums. Okay, and I think over to you, Steph, for the rest of the evaluation.
Thanks so much, Kelly. So moving on to evaluating this campaign, the project overall, all of the deliverables of the project. We established some key indicators using output, reach, effectiveness, and outcome measures. I won't speak to the output measures today. That's largely based on what we produced with the funding available, how many resources we were able to add to the available resources on this topic, where we saw gaps where those resources were needed. I'll speak a little bit to the reach effectiveness and outcome measures that we are tracking for this campaign. Please do note that this project does continue until the end of this month, so these numbers aren't completely final. We still have more to collect in terms of data, but these are the results we've had so far, which covers the vast majority of the length of the program. So in terms of reach, we wanted to look at how effectively we were getting to youth and to parents, as well as to professionals, as these were our defined target audiences. We also wanted to look at effectiveness of the campaign. How did youth respond to it? Was it seen as credible, interesting, and potentially having an impact on them or being memorable to them? We also looked at potential outcomes from the project, primarily looking at those knowledge and attitudes among youth, and did we mark any change in those over the course of the program? Of course, noting that this project sits within a broader context of what's happening societally on this topic targeted to youth. And also because part of our focus was to offer learning opportunities to professionals, we also wanted to look at knowledge change in professionals from these learning opportunities. In terms of reach of the campaign, to date we've tracked more than 80 million impressions for the campaign overall. And not all of those impressions can be tracked right down to demographic information. So for example, when we're sharing a post on our social media accounts using and tracking the hashtag that we're using, we don't necessarily know who's accounting for all those impressions. However, when we do targeted ads and targeted placements on social media, or for example, in the digital boards we were able to use, then we can actually get a clear explanation from those of who was being targeted and reached through those activities. So we know from the 6 TikTok ads, 6 because there was an equal parts in English and in French, we saw 2.95 million impressions reaching youth within our defined age demographic. As well, from the activities Anusha and Kelly described for phase 1, the campus ad boards, the sign views of that impaired installation, various influencer posts and boosted social media posts, we had a reach of 11.8 million impressions, again, to our target age demographic. So that's the reach to youth that we absolutely have data for. We also wanted to know that youth were seeing the ads. And so in our, we conducted a post survey sort of after the program ran, repeating in a lot of ways our pre-survey, but adding some questions about the actual exposure of parachute specific campaign. So 30% of the youth surveyed recalled seeing parachute ads. And overall, they were 44% recalled seeing any ad about cannabis and driving. So whether it was parachute or from some other source. And we asked if they had seen any of these campaigns within the past 3 months. There was a statistically significant decrease from 2019 to 2020 in the number of youth who actually responded yes, that they had seen any campaign. And so I wanted to comment a little bit on some potential reasons why this decrease might have happened. First of all, there was a surge of messaging, particularly aimed at youth in 2018 and 2019, following the legalization of cannabis in Canada and then the legalization of edible cannabis products in Canada. So there were a lot of examples of messaging in lots of different places coming from various sources focused on youth. So there may have just been more in market at those times. As well, in the last few years, as I said, this has flooded the environment. It's become more of a topic of conversation following legalization. And so we potentially have an adjustment within youth and all people in Canada, adjustment and getting used to seeing these types of ads. So they may not stand out as much as when they were new and novel. And again, these ads are really being targeted to the youth demographic as a high risk group for both injury and other potential health harms. So again, this group has been seeing a lot, so perhaps not all of it is getting through the filter as they continue to be surrounded by these messages. And finally, when we did the post-evaluation survey, we did this in November 2020. And of course, we can't talk about 2020 without talking about COVID-19. So we're certainly competing with other messaging in the health space and in the public awareness space around COVID at the same time that the final phase of the campaign was starting to roll out, and also at the time of the survey. So lots of other messaging and ads, particularly public health messaging, would be top of mind during that period. In terms of tracking our reach to our professional partners, we, through sharing e-blasts and links to and information about the resources and accessing the videos and other collateral, we ultimately disseminated campaign information to 3,000 partners. And in our previous webinar that we conducted in 2019, we had 81 professional participants. Part of our planned reach to professionals, part of our knowledge translation strategy was to leverage conferences and other event opportunities to talk about the campaign. And of course, that was affected by COVID-19. We're seeing now more and more conferences go into digital events. However, early on into the pandemic, we saw a lot of events were just outright canceled or postponed. So those opportunities weren't presented even in a digital space. So all survey respondents, whether they said they had seen a parachute ad or not, were then shown examples of the campaign ads. They were explained to that the ads were part of a larger Know What Impaired Means campaign meant to highlight the negative effect cannabis has on driving ability, specifically motor and cognitive skills. And the youth respondents were asked, how well did these ads communicate the intended message? So 76% of respondents felt the campaign was moderately to extremely effective in communicating the intended message. So we were fairly successful in getting our message across, even though we used a bit of a play and a bit of a convincing, connecting rather than convincing outright direct tactic. Looking at that idea of attitudes, knowledge, and behaviors pre and post 2019 and 2020, these have remained stable. And so the good news is that 2/3 of youth report that they don't engage in risky behaviors related to cannabis-impaired driving, whether it's driving themselves or being a passenger with a driver who has used cannabis. And sustaining that majority is really important. As we know from other issues, like seatbelts and alcohol-impaired driving, shifts in culture need to be maintained and sustained, and we can't let up. So some of these issues have been, targeted for decades, and I think we see the importance of sustaining messaging around cannabis-impaired driving as well as part of our continued messaging, particularly to youth. There is an opportunity here to look at that 1/3 of youth who do report risky behaviors and to better understand how to drive change in that group specifically. Among professionals, we saw a positive change in knowledge. So we asked about self-reported knowledge before and after the first webinar learning opportunity. The mean score for knowledge before the webinar was 3.0, and after the webinar it was 4.1, indicating a positive change in knowledge. The majority of respondents had a change score of +1. That was 70% of respondents changed by +1, followed by a score of +2, and then a neutral score of 0, no change. 100% of our professional survey respondents reported being confident or very confident in applying the content to their work. And of course, I'll put my first plug here that we will also be looking to evaluate the results of this webinar. And it's a really important part of our understanding and reporting on the success of the program. So when you're prompted to participate in that, we would really appreciate you doing so. So we also wanted to learn out of this program, what do youth think are effective educational approaches for the topic of cannabis-impaired driving for them? And so they were given a list of potential strategies and asked they could select as many or as few as they wanted to tell us what they felt would be effective. So we see public education in various settings, such as in cannabis stores, in high school curricula, as well as through PSAs like the one we're describing here today. From 2019 to 2020, so between the two surveys, there was a statistically significant increase in the proportion of respondents who selected cannabis addiction support programs as an opportunity to reach youth. So that's an interesting change, perhaps in openness or seeing the value of these types of programs. And it's interesting in particular, it would be interesting to dig into that. Personally, I find because in the past, we've seen a lot of discourse around the fact that there's no way that cannabis is addictive. So seeing more youth openness to the idea that there are support programs and that these are good good opportunities to educate youth, it is an interesting opportunity. Those are, the big highlights from our evaluation indicators. I will move into some of the key lessons we learned along the way. Some of those have been mentioned already, and I'm recapping, and some will be kind of new additions to this discussion based on our findings. So some of the key lessons learned. First of all, we found through our surveys that the pattern seemed to be that youth who believe that cannabis impairs a person's ability to drive are less likely to engage in risky behaviors. And this, of course, is based on self-report, but it confirms that relationship between perception, attitude, and behaviors. So that's important to confirm that. 67% of our respondents said they would be comfortable asking a peer who was under the influence of cannabis, would speak up to them, perhaps saying they didn't feel comfortable with them driving, potentially taking their keys, saying, communicating the danger with them. And so there is an opportunity within that to grow that number and to build confidence and skills among youth to actually speak up with their peers. And this is something that's been focused on for the topic of alcohol impaired driving, and it's no different for cannabis impaired driving. Those skills are very important, that we give youth the tools they need to manage these situations, which we can all admit are incredibly challenging. They can be very awkward in the very least. It's particularly important to think about passenger behavior and speaking up to peers, particularly when we're reaching out to young women who, based on various survey results, both ours and others that we reviewed, tend to report being passengers, tend to report passengers riding with impaired drivers, and tend to report slightly lower confidence in speaking up for themselves. We felt that this campaign showed us through the data that targeted social media approaches are effective for reaching a defined audience. So getting the message to the audience that you are hoping to reach, really targeting and promoting and boosting your campaigns is effective for accomplishing that. Of course, when we look at attitudes and behaviors, we have to consider within a broader societal and cultural context. So, social media alone isn't going to, on its own, cause that shift, but it's one piece in the puzzle contributing to how we reach certain audiences with information. And we know that receiving messages from different places, repeating the same message, are effective ways of getting messages through to people for behavior change. We also found from our survey that youth generally have a positive perception of public awareness campaigns. We may think that they think of them as cheesy or write them off, but generally the results showed that youth found them relatively impactful, that they found they came from credible sources. We also are seeing that youth support other forms of education besides PSAs, including educational approaches in school and in cannabis retail stores. And there were some key challenges along the way, and particularly for this being a digital program focused on cannabis and targeting youth. Kelly spoke to some of the challenges in getting through on social media, getting through regulations and policies to get this messaging out. So just to recap, that there are challenges in promoting cannabis-related messaging on social media, in getting your ads approved on these platforms and maintained on the platforms, not taken down. And again, that's because, while this is legal in cannabis, major social media platforms are owned outside of Canada. And even though we target the ad to reach a Canadian audience, an audience residing in Canada, from their perspective, you are reaching out to promote information considered to be pro-drug and illegal in most areas of the world. And it doesn't seem to matter the context of health promotion and safety messaging. The piece that stands out is this is about a drug, and we don't want to include that on our platform. So one of the things, again, Kelly alluded to this already, is on TikTok, we couldn't use the terms cannabis or high, but in looking to the users themselves and how they talk about these topics on these platforms is a great way to find solutions. And Kelly mentioned our great social media specialist, Margarita, brought this forward to our team. And so even on these platforms where there are, particularly TikTok, which is quite restrictive, there are still conversations that people of all ages, especially young people, want to have, whether it's about drugs, whether it's about sexual assault and rape. These are the kinds of terms that are actually, sort of banned or censored and taken down on the TikTok platform. So users themselves are still trying to have these conversations. It's still part of their lives. So they are finding solutions to connect with each other and to speak of these topics. And so the example here is this emoji solution to talking about cannabis use. So you see the leaves and the puff. This is just one example. There's some different variations, but as you can see on the slide, using this emoji as a hashtag as of a couple days ago, posts on TikTok using this emoji hashtag had 73.8 million views of those videos. So, so these are popular tools that people are connecting about. So tapping into those is really important for us to reach through and reach around. So that covers the main content of our presentation today. We do want to thank our project funder for the full Know What Impaired Means program. Health Canada's Substance Use and Addictions program has provided funding for this program since 2019. So thank you for your attention to this point. I will invite Julie to turn her camera on and join us, as well as Kelly and Anusha to turn their cameras back on, so that we can have a little bit of time for question and answer. And so, Julie, I will hand it over to you to direct questions to the group.
Okay, great. Thanks, Steph. So we did have a few really good questions that came in. There's one question around, they're curious on the rationale for choosing a 4-hour time frame for cannabis and driving. Some national surveys use 2 hours, others that they've seen use 5 hours. Steph, is that something that you can speak to?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a good question. And these are the kinds of things where it would be interesting to see some kind of standard approaches and consistency build across the field. You're correct. There are different surveys and different messaging that speak to time period. The big challenge is that we don't have an evidence-informed, validated sort of time period of when it is or is not kind of safe to drive after using cannabis. So it's looking at what are some kind of reasonable timelines we can look at within that. We did review what was used across different surveys. We also noted that some organizations like Mothers Against Drug Driving are using a 4-hour period in their messaging. So we kind of landed there to kind of align with perhaps a number that youth were hearing about. We did ask youth further questions in the survey about their perception of driving within different timelines, things like that. So we did have a little bit more information in getting perceptions on that. But I do agree that, to be able to look across different surveys and different points of data, it would be effective to have a consistent number so we can compare across data sources.
Great. There's another question here around some of the social media language. What is meant by impressions? What does that include precisely?
I guess that's mine to take.
Sounds like a Kelly question.
It is a Kelly question. Impressions are, I always like to say that impressions are lies, but we all lie in the same way, so we can count on them. Okay, so that's my number one point. Impressions are usually, and they are calculated in different ways, but it is shorthand for, if we go back to the days of when we had newspaper circulations, we still do, of course they're shrinking, but we could say that this newspaper has a circulation of 100,000. They would print 100,000 papers and they would be delivered. They would often have something called a readership number, which was a multiplier. So you could say there's 100,000 papers and we're going to assume that there are going to be 3 people look at each physical copy of the paper. So the readership number is 300,000. When we started moving into social media, again, it is one of these things is what is the potential? Now, realistically, even when you had that newspaper that has 100,000 printed copies, it doesn't mean that your story or your ad is going to have 100,000 people seeing it, but there's that potential. You know, the person who looks at the paper may not read your story, may not look at that section, may not look at the paper that day, but there was that potential. So this concept of potential viewers is what informs impressions in our social media world. So for instance, I happen to have our Facebook, our Twitter account rather, has about 9,000 followers here on Twitter. My personal account has 1,500. So if I take something that is on a Parachute feed and I retweet it, the calculations go that, oh, I have 1,500 followers. So that's another 1,500 potential impressions. Potentially 1,500 people could see this. And so on it goes. Every time something is repeated and the hashtag is used, it assumes that everybody who follows whoever posts or repeats it, that everyone sees it. That, of course, is not the case. Not everybody sees everything on everyone's feed. We're not on social media 24/7, but it is that, consider it like potential audience. It's being published in feeds and in places where there are potentially that many people who could see it. So when we say something has millions of impressions, the fact is it's been published in streams with those potential views. We also know from marketing principles that people need to see the message over and over again. When we are looking at things like billboard statistics and things like digital sign statistics, you know yourself, if you have routines. When we used to commute to work, some of us, you might drive the same road every day. Well, you're one person, but you might see that billboard 25 times because you drove by it morning and night, however many times in a month. But every one of those potential views is an impression. So billboards have actually quite high impression rates because they calculate the average traffic on the road where that billboard exists and says there are that many views. So it's actually a good thing that if somebody sees something repeatedly, there is a chance the message will stick. So we're not saying that we're reaching 12 million people. We're saying that there were 12 million potentials for this to be viewed, often multiple views by the same individual. So I hope that clarifies it.
Great. And Kelly, kind of connected to that question, a question around how would funding impact your reach?
Oh, immensely. Absolutely immensely. You pay to play often. When we talk about those targeted, and Stephanie explained that very well, about the difference between sort of general, what we call organics, things that are posted and are shared where we can't track that. The tracking mechanisms come into play when these are paid placements. So we are able to then say, I want this ad to be seen by people in this age range, in this geographic area. Sometimes at Parachute, we do campaigns that are focused on a particular province because we have funding from, say, a provincial government office. So we will target the ad in Ontario or out west. So we can then get better data about who potentially has seen that ad. So the more investment, the better we go. Now, we were very, very fortunate to have a good partnership with Bell Canada, Bell Media, who offers us media space, because for us to buy that airtime to air those have this talk commercials would have probably bankrupted Parachute. Right? We simply just don't have the kind of funding for that. What we tend to get funding for is our government sponsors will give us funding to create the collateral that is of a professional quality, which can then attract and a billboard company or a media company will be willing to run the stuff because it is of a standard that matches what they're willing to air. The social media companies, so far, they're not very charitably minded. We can't get any freebies for hell nor high water, as my mother used to say. So, you know, it's we do pay when we are in social media mode. However, some of the what is called the legacy medias, whether it's out of home billboard or television, they will generously donate space to us, which is how we can extend our reach.
Great. So another question here around the stats. What happens to your stats when you break them into 16 to 19 and 20 to 24? I don't know if that's something that you can address, Steph.
Yeah, it's definitely something I can follow up on. I unfortunately don't have all of the breakdowns in front of me right now, but we did examine the stats by those different age groups, as well as by sex, by cannabis use, and other subgroupings. So I'd be happy to follow up with the registrants of the webinar to explain some of that detail further.
Okay, great. And then another question around what part of the campaign got the best response? Kelly, I don't know if you want to speak briefly to that.
We certainly had, if you could recall back to the first campaign, we were able to track we called those two spots, the skydiver and the rock climber. It was a series of commercials showed someone going off for their first skydiving attempt, their first rock climbing attempt, and then the person who was supposed to be maintaining their safety, the parachute packer, and the person holding the rope appeared to be a bit off. They were, wondering if they were high, and it made them nervous. So you wouldn't drive with somebody who's high. Why would you let somebody hold your pack your parachute or hold your safety line? Those ads, we found that skydiver performed much better, but ironically, much better in English Canada. When we looked at the engagement and the pickup of in the Quebec market, the skydiver, the rock climber did better. So sometimes we find these, and we have no idea why the rock climber was more appealing in Quebec than it was, but skydiver was about a 70-30 split in terms of engagement and promotion. When we looked at I think the most popular of those little ones we did this year on TikTok was the dog, because it was part of that trend on TikTok about doing the song doing a bad thing, and it got a little extra pickup.
Great. And I know a number of you were asking about whether we can share the slides, and yeah, we'd definitely be able to do that. And right now we are recording this session. So we can also send out the recorded session to all of the participants.
Yeah, and Julie, I'll add that when we send out the slides as well, we will include the references for the various statistics and data we've presented throughout the presentation, if you're interested in digging further into those.
Great. Yeah, and I think that's it. And unless anybody else has any other questions you want to type into the Q&A, we have a few more minutes.
I can also share, while people are thinking about another question, about, again, some of the challenges in working in this field. It has been fascinating. We have talked about how we've had issues with we are also running another campaign that is separate from this campaign, but it is about safe storage in high and lot. And we've just come across something with this, is that last year we had absolutely no problem getting ads promoted on Twitter, the exact same collateral that we had no problems with 12 months ago. This year it was a solid week of rejections. And it's an interesting thing, if any of you are working in this field, is that you need to, sometimes these things are rejected by algorithm. It simply pulls up, there's a banned word, or there's a banned, something triggers, and it is automatically cut back. And then you have to appeal and hope that you can actually reason with a human being. But another effect of COVID too is that there have been cutbacks in some of these large media companies, and they don't have the number of staff that used to be able to respond to appeals for rejections for things like this. So it's a real challenge to get this messaging forward.
Okay, yeah, it doesn't look like there's any other questions popping up. But of course, feel free to get in touch with any of us after this session if you do have questions that come up.
And also for people who might not have seen the original ads, we do have them posted on our parachute.ca. If you just go parachute.ca/know what impaired means, or go to our program pages, go to know what impaired means. All of the materials that we've been discussing are there if you want to give them a view, if you want to share them, use the resources in a classroom or any other group of people who might be interested in viewing.
Thanks, Kelly. Well, yeah, we'll be sure to share those, include those links. You can visit that today. Now you have the info from Kelly, but we'll be sure to share those links when we send out the slides and the recording to make sure you have it on hand. And a really important point that, while our funded campaign is wrapping up, of course, all of these resources will still be available. We'll still be addressing this topic. So this is not, the end of the line for sharing this information, sharing those resources, and we'd be happy to hear from you about how you are sharing those out. We love to learn about how these resources might be benefiting our partners and communities across the country. So thank you, Julie, for hopping on and helping us out with the Q&A session. That was fantastic. Thank you all for submitting your questions, really insightful questions for us. As we end this webinar, you will be prompted immediately to fill out our evaluation survey. We, of course, really appreciate you taking the time to do that. As you can see, it does help us evaluate our programs, as well as in our reporting back to our funder to show that funding in programs like this, funding in injury prevention, is valuable and effective. Thank you, Kelly and Anusha, my co-presenters. Fantastic job, everyone. And I hope everyone has a great day and stay safe out there. Take care.
And also know that we are going to be able to extend our Know What Impaired Means campaign to a bit older demographic. So that's coming up in the months ahead. So stay tuned.
Stay tuned. There you go. Hot off the press. Thanks, everyone.